What is up, everybody? Clint Lamb with Touchdown Alabama Magazine, sitting here with my co-host Jake Weaver, also with Touchdown Alabama Magazine, and yet again, this is Bama Versus. What we wanted to talk about today with the draft coming up at the end of April is we wanted to compare Alabama's class this season to their one last season that featured some record-holding numbers. So, Jake, with these two classes, it's pretty interesting because we all saw the final product for last year's class, but this year's can be as good. Talk a little bit about this year's class.
Well, Clint, this year's class, it features a lot more in the defensive back secondary area. A guy like Minkah Fitzpatrick, who's expected to be a top 10 pick, easily could go top 5. And then Ronnie Harrison, who's also considered a top 15, top 20 guy. You know, both of those being safeties. We're seeing a whole lot more of that secondary help than we did last year. You're also going to see a little different from the offensive side of the football as well, Clint. I think with Bo Scarborough, Calvin Ridley, I think those are some guys who, you know, Bo Scarborough, bigger running back, but he's the kind of guy who really could succeed in the NFL. I mean, he's a Marshawn Lynch type of physical running back. He's a guy who can really put his head down and get upfield. And then, of course, Calvin Ridley, also a top 15, top 20 guy. I think you're going to see the difference, especially on the offensive side of the ball as well.
Well, you know, I think that when you're looking at guys like Calvin Ridley compared to Bo Scarborough, we saw two very different combine performances from both guys. Ridley did have the blazing 40-yard dash with the 4.43, but his broad jump, his vertical, he just, in every other facet, as far as the testing goes, he didn't exactly shine. That does not mean that I don't think he's going to be a quality NFL receiver. I don't think that it matters that he can't jump through the roof. He only has a 31-inch vertical. When he's able to create over 5 yards of separation just based off of his elite route running ability. But you look at a guy like Bo Scarborough and what he was able to do. I mean, came in at 6'1", 232 pounds, ran a 4.5, 240, 40-inch vertical, 10.9 broad jump. To me, he brings the athleticism to the position that you want. I think that he can succeed in almost any offense. I think he can do well in a power scheme, obviously with his size and strength. But I think that he's also very underrated in the same way that Derrick Henry was underrated and continues to be, as far as being able to be a outside zone running back as well. He can run the different zone schemes. But, it's like you said, this year's class with the secondary just stacked from top to bottom. I mean, Alabama's top 6 defensive backs from last year all have the potential to be on an NFL roster, and that includes Hootie Jones. I know that he's been dealing with an injury and hadn't been able to test and things of that nature, but he also has the raw ability to at least get a camp invite. But last year's class in the secondary, when you look at the fact that Marlon Humphrey was able to get drafted in the first round, he was the first Alabama player taken in last year's draft to the Baltimore Ravens at number 16, the success that he had. And then you look at a guy like Eddie Jackson, who was drafted much later due to that broken leg that he suffered midway through last year, but he was also able to bring a lot of success to the Chicago Bears secondary. So while the numbers are heavily in favor of the 2017 class, the 2018 class, I think the 2017 class in the secondary was also pretty solid. To me, when you look at last year's class, what is a position, where do you think last year's class was strongest at as far as a certain position or maybe just a side of the football?
I mean, I think you have to look at the linebackers. I mean, you're talking about Reuben Foster, who really should have been a top 10 guy. Obviously, he's had some troubles in this offseason, so we're not really sure exactly where his status stands going into next year. But he was tremendous. Besides his injury in his rookie season, he was a tremendous, tremendous linebacker. But definitely had the looks of a future all-pro guy. Hopefully, he can get back on the field and stay out of trouble. Then Ryan Anderson for the Redskins, he saw the field some. He was able to make some plays. Wasn't quite as explosive as he was for Alabama, but he was still a guy who definitely has a lot of promise. He's a guy with a lot of promise and a lot of potential heading into his second year. And then, of course, Tim Williams. And Tim Williams was very skilled at that one thing as far as rushing the passer, getting to the quarterback. It's something that we will see from him still in the NFL. We're still going to see that from him, but he's got to figure out the mental side of things. It's a lot different in the NFL, Clint. I think we can both agree with that. It's a different universe. While he was insanely good for Alabama. He's going to have to figure out some of those ins and outs of the NFL scheme. But Clint, to answer your question, man, I just think that these linebackers, the linebacking core of last year's draft, just was their strongest point.
Well, I think
no question about it.
I think you make a great point. I think that Ryan Anderson and what he brings to the table, you're talking about a guy that does everything well, but does nothing elite. But I think that he's going to be one of those type of players in the NFL that never quite gets the credit that he deserves. Now, last year he didn't exactly perform as well as most people had hoped. A lot of people at least thought he would be a lot more pro-ready than he was. He did see some snaps, but I do foresee him being a lot better in year two, like you said, obviously with Reuben Foster. I mean, I don't think I've ever scouted a linebacker prospect with the raw talent that a guy like Reuben Foster brought to the table last year. But this year's class with the linebackers, you're talking about some underrated guys. Rashaan Evans, to me, now he's finally starting to get a little bit of that attention. He looked phenomenal. I was able to attend Alabama's Pro Day last week, and he looked phenomenal going through drills. We still don't know what he runs the 40 in. He elected to sit out at the Combine and at his Pro Day with the 40, but just watching him go through drills, you can see why he is going to be such a coveted NFL prospect. And then I also don't think that people need to forget about Sean Deion Hamilton. I do think that injury is going to prevent him from being drafted. It is possible that he could be a late round pick, but I think that he's a guy that kind of, maybe not to the degree that Eddie Jackson was, but sort of in the same way that Jackson's stock was affected by an injury. I think Sean Deion Hamilton ends up on an NFL roster next year. I think he makes the team. I think he could end up being he's never going to be a spectacular playmaking linebacker like a guy like Reuben Foster or CJ Mosley was, but I do think that he could be a steady player and actually contribute to an NFL defense. But, you look at, last year's numbers, 4 first-round picks, 3 second-round picks, 2 third-round picks, 9 total players selected within the first 2 days of the draft. Do you think that Alabama can match those numbers in this year's class?
I don't think anybody can match those numbers. I don't think we're going to be able to match those numbers again for a long time. I don't think any school in this year's draft is going to be able to match those numbers again. I mean, I think you have guys. I will say that I think Minka's a first-round pick. Rashaan Evans, first-round pick. Anthony Averett, second round, maybe a third-round pick. He's still a guy who I think is a gem. Ronnie Harrison is certainly a first-round pick. Calvin Ridley, and that gives you about 5 possible first-round picks. But I just don't think that you're going to see 4 more guys go after that. Well,
to me, I think that we could end up seeing some guys being taken a lot earlier than people were predicting. I don't. With Bo Scarborough's combine, it would be possible for him to sneak into the 3rd round. I don't think that's going to happen. I think he's more of a 4th round guy, maybe even 5th, to be quite honest, just because of the depth of that position in this year's class. But I think he has the talent to go in the 3rd round or higher. I think you're right on Averett. I think that with his his combine performance, running that 4.36, that really helped his stock. I mean, we all know knew he was fast, and he showed that he could be a shutdown corner at times during his career at Alabama. He just needs to be able to do it on a lot more consistent basis. But 2 guys that I think could go much higher, of course, I've already touched on Rashaan Evans. I think that he is a top 15 lock, potentially even top 10. And I know that sounds crazy. I think that when you look at the fact that he hadn't played the linebacker position, inside linebacker for too long, and what he was able to do and the growth that he had over his last couple of years since making that switch, the sky's the limit for him. And athletically, he does provide a lot of the same things, except for he's a lot bigger than Reuben Foster, but his closing speed is similar. He's a dominant type of skill player on Alabama's defense and can be in the NFL. But the other guy's Daron Payne. I think that with his combine performance, much like a lot of the other Alabama guys, he's going to be able to really help that stock. I had kind of seen him maybe being a late 1st rounder before maybe the Pittsburgh Steelers at 28 or the Tennessee Titans. They could use a zero technique with the former Baltimore defense coordinator now moving over to coach the defense there. They had Brandon Williams and Haloti Ngata during his time with the Ravens. I think that Payne would fit perfectly with what they would be trying to do. But now I could even see him going in the top half of the 1st round to maybe a team like the Redskins. I know that Jonathan Allen and Ryan Anderson would absolutely love that. Payne is just one of those guys, a 4.95, 40-yard dash at 311 pounds. I mean, a lot of people were not expecting that sort of athleticism for a guy his size. but the production wasn't necessarily there. Now, he did a lot of the dirty work and wasn't able to fill the stat sheets, but I mean, only 102 tackles, only 5 tackles for loss and 3 sacks over the course of his 3 years at Alabama. As far as Payne, do you think that he can make a more immediate impact, more so in the same, we saw Dalvin Tomlinson last year, and he was phenomenal playing next to Damon Harrison for the New York Giants. But what about Jonathan Allen? He was playing okay before that season-ending injury, but he didn't make nearly the impact that a lot of people thought he was going to when he was projected to be a first-round pick. Do you think Daron Payne ends up being more on the Dalvin Tomlinson side of things or more on the Jonathan Allen?
Well, I think Daron Payne is like the healthy combination of the two. Jonathan Allen was so good because of his athleticism and his ability to make plays on the defensive line that most other players couldn't make. Dalvin Tomlinson is the big run-stuffing guy who can also, make it a little easier for the linebackers to get to the quarterback. I think Payne is kind of that healthy mix of the two. And, I don't know. I think Payne could end up being the best of all three of them. I don't think anybody saw that coming, like you said. But I think Daron Payne, with his size, his 6'2", 311 size, he brings so much to the table as far as doing both things. He's got the hands and the arms, the ability to get past the blocker on the line of scrimmage, which you don't see in a lot of nose tackles. You don't see that in a lot of defensive tackles. The ability to swim past that first line of blockers and get to the backfield is something that is priceless for an NFL defense.
Well, what's interesting is how dominant he was in the playoffs. And I think that is what NFL teams are looking at, and they're just salivating over. Because if he can become that guy on a consistent basis, he's going to be one of the premier interior defensive line in the NFL. But you have to ask yourself, why was he not that dominant the rest of the year? He showed flashes.
And I think the reason he wasn't as dominant the rest of the year, you might have be about to hit on this, is I think it was a lot of scheme. I think Alabama came into that game a month later, given time for everybody to rest, knowing we're a little thin at linebacker, we need more pressure. And they changed the scheme of the line. I think what you've noticed is Daron Payne made huge plays in those last 2 games because they changed their scheme up front, the way their hat on the hat type of thing, the way that they played against the offensive lines. And I also think you had to look at it from a prospect. Let's just be honest here. Clemson's offensive line left a lot to be desired. Payne took advantage.
Absolutely.
Georgia, great team, pretty physical offensive line, but they're a running team.
Well,
they threw it a lot, but they're a running team.
But, I will say Isaiah Wynn, he started at left tackle for Georgia, and granted, I think he's an NFL guard, but he didn't get a chance to go against Payne with him playing on the outside for Georgia. But that Georgia offensive line was pretty dang good, and I don't think, going back and watching that film, I don't think Payne lost a single snap. He beat his guy on every single play in that national championship game, and it was truly one of the best defensive line performances from start to finish that I've ever seen from an Alabama defensive lineman. What about the other guy, though? Deshaun Hand. That's a guy that never lived up to his potential, a former number 1 overall player in the country coming out of high school, gets to Alabama, was able to earn playing time early. To me, he seemed like a little bit of a miscast in that 3-4 defense. I think with the added weight, he's now up to 297, being 6'4", had a phenomenal combine performance as well, running a 4.83, putting up 28 reps in the bench press and a 31.5-inch vertical. I mean, that's at the pro day. I mean, you can't fully appreciate Deshaun Hand as a physical specimen until you're standing near the guy. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. What do you think about him? Where do you think project him going? Maybe not a team, but kind of in the range, because I've seen people all over the place with this guy.
Well, with Hand, it's ironic you say Hand, because I was thinking Daron Payne, and the biggest thing with Daron Payne's ability to get past them guys was his hands. He's got great hands. But I think with Hand, what you look at is, man, he's got the physical tools. For some reason, he never put it together. But I think you hit it on the head. I think he belongs in a 4-3. I think he should be one of the 2 techniques. He should be one of the defensive tackles up front in a 4-3. I could easily see this guy fall in second, third round. based on what production he has alone, he should be a 4th or a 5th round pick. The fact that he played at Alabama boosts him a little bit. The fact that he was a number 1 recruit boosts him. And then the fact that he did so well, like you said, at the combine, and he tested very, very well for a guy his size. I think that has to boost him a little. And so when you add all that together, 2nd or 3rd round, you look at a team like Dallas. Dallas is in desperate need for defensive linemen. They have very badly been on the defensive line in these last few years. However, Payne brings that ability to come in and play one of those 2 defensive tackle positions, and then he can come out on the ends on some plays. But I think you could really look at him in a 4-3 and say, hey, this is a guy that I would spend a 2nd or 3rd round pick on based on his abilities alone.
Well, I think that he could definitely – I completely agree with you. I think that the perfect fit, I think he can play 3-4 defensive end in the NFL with that added weight. But at the same time, I think the way that he should be used is in a similar way to the way that the Seattle Seahawks have used Michael Bennett before trading him to the Eagles. And that's as a 4-3 base end, stopping the run on early downs and then kicking him inside on passing downs. I think that is his ideal spot in the NFL. And more than likely, we're going to see a team take him earlier than a lot of people expect. I have a late 3rd round grade on him. And, from a pure athletic standpoint, he should be, borderline 1st round. But at the same time, the production, the off the field issues with the DUI prior to the season, I do think that's, of course, going to push his stock down. And teams, of course, are going to wonder, if you're such a freak, why weren't you able to succeed at Alabama? But, I think that probably the biggest guy, and we've talked about him a little bit, you and me personally, off air, is Tony Brown. And that, to me, people are, as much as they are all over the board with Deshaun Hand, Tony Brown is a guy that I am very interested to get your thoughts on. Tell everybody what you think about him and his potential.
Well, like you said, we talked a lot about this off air, and I think with Tony Brown, in my film study, Tony Brown's not a guy who's going to cover. He's a corner that can't cover, which doesn't seem to make much sense. But you brought up a good point that he maybe is just not great at mirroring. Maybe he could play more of a safety. My thing was, if Tony Brown's to get picked up in the 4th round, which is I think he'll be a 4th round guy, I just don't see him being worth a 3rd or 2nd. I think if he kind of goes in and plays that Mark Barron role that Mark Barron has played, done with the Rams, and he puts a little extra weight on, he's going to be able to use his speed to really, really, really give them some tremendous run support, whoever gets him. He's a guy that's going to see the field because of his athleticism. He's going to see the field because he can run past guys that he shouldn't be able to run past. He's going to be able to, and as a safety, with his speed, he's going to be able to correct and recover better than most safeties in the NFL. So I think he's going to be a guy who, if he goes and he does become that safety linebacker hybrid, I think he's easily worth a 4th round pick, maybe a 3rd round pick. But Clint, what do you think about it?
Well, I think that he's going to immediately be one of the top contributors on special teams for whichever team ends up drafting him. And that provides value in itself. And I think that based off of his potential and the way that he's performed in these testing drills this offseason, combined with the fact that you're going to be getting an elite special teams player on your coverage units, I think that he's going to end up going higher than most people think too. I agree with you. I don't necessarily think he makes it into the 3rd round, but I do think 4th round, early on day 3 is a very strong possibility for him. And it's like I told you when we were talking about it before, I see him being used in the same way that the Falcons use Kemal Ishmael, which is, of course, safety. They can play him at safety, but they also roll him down as a will linebacker in their 4-3 defense, let him cover some tight ends and do things of that nature. I think that he has the ability to do that. I think you can, in some instances, play him as a nickel corner on the inside, but it's like you said, the hip fluidity is an issue. I don't think he can mirror to the degree that you would want from a slot guy. And so I think that more so we're going to see a key special teams contributor, a potential safety, and a linebacker. But he's definitely not on the level of Minka or Ronnie Harrison or Eddie Jackson or Marlon Humphrey. I mean, they're on a completely different tier. And I don't think that he's going to be Anthony Averett either. Now, granted, I had this debate with someone else before recently where we kind of had the debate of which one ends up having a better NFL career. And to me, I think Averett can end up being really good. I do worry about his size. He does have the length, being 6 foot, but only 185 pounds. That's not terrible, but it is a little light. I worry about his durability in the NFL. But it's a matter of, does Tony Brown's special teams ability prolong his NFL career to a point where you can now confidently say that he's had the better overall career between the two? And that's where the debate for me comes in. But when you compare the two classes, and you're talking, it's like we said, we've kind of touched on the first round picks or the day 2 picks. Some of these late round guys, I think that Alabama is a lot deeper later on in this year's draft than they were last year. After Eddie Jackson being drafted at 112 overall to the Chicago Bears, there wasn't another Alabama player selected. Now, there was some guys like Garrett Dieter, Brandon Green, Corin Curvin, who all ended up on NFL rosters, and Dieter in particular was building some pretty strong rapport with now starting quarterback Patrick Mahomes for the Kansas City Chiefs. I think he ends up significantly outperforming being an undrafted free agent. But what about some of these late round guys for Alabama in this year's class? I mean, you're talking about guys like Robert Foster, Cam Sims, Josh Frazier, to me, Levi Wallace. And then, of course, we already touched a little bit on Shondae Hamilton. Give me your thoughts on comparing maybe the top isn't as strong in your opinion as it was last year, but what about some of those depth guys later on in the draft?
Well, I agree with that. I think that there was a lot more strength up top in last year's draft. There's a lot more sure things. I think, to me, Jonathan Allen, Foster, I think those were guys. Humphrey even was. I think those were guys who were pretty sure things going into it. But I think there's a lot more gems, you could say. I think when you look at this whole class and everything that you could bring to the table with this class, there's a lot of guys later in the draft. Like we said, Deshaun Hand could easily fall 4th, 5th round. Bo Scarborough's a guy who could be a 4th or 5th round pick. He could fall earlier, but you never know. Running backs aren't as needed in the NFL as they had been in the past. And then let's not forget J.K. Scott. He's a punter. Kickers are a little more valuable than punters in the NFL, but punters still get drafted, and he might be a 6th round guy. He's still a guy who's going to bring a difference to the table for whoever picks him up. But to look at it from what you're saying, I think there is more depth in the later ends and the later rounds. And Levi Wallace is a guy who I'm high on personally. He's also kind of small. He's got some of the same issues there. He doesn't have as much productivity, not as many stats, not as many starts and plays, and you have to wonder, well, why? Ultimately, with Levi, though, I think he's a guy who's going to go in and he's going to be sort of that 6th or 7th round guy. He might even fall into free agency, and he's going to make a team slowly but surely, build his rapport with them, and he'll kind of do like he did at Alabama. He'll float along. He'll see some field eventually, I believe. I do personally believe that. I'm not going to say he's a starter in the NFL, but he's a guy who's going to have a future.
Well, I do think that you're correct. I think that he's already embraced the underdog role once in his career at Alabama, being a former walk-on, and he was able to rise to the top of the depth chart and make an impact. And I think him, as far as being a coverage corner or a cover corner, he should do just fine in the NFL. I really worry about his ability to provide support against the run. In that Auburn game, I mean, it's phenomenal as Wallace had played all season. I think Auburn really exposed him. You go back and watch that film, and they attacked him running the football, and he did not do a good job of getting off the opposing receiver and making tackles. And I think that is an issue that NFL teams are going to look at and say, does he have the frame to be able to add the necessary weight to correct that weakness? And I just don't know. With his slender frame, is he able to provide an impact on special teams? Now, granted, with him being a walk-on, he does have plenty of experience on special teams, and that should help. But I agree with you. I love the depth of this class compared to last year's. And I think you hit the nail on the head in the way that you put it when you said there's a lot more gems. I think that just there are so many guys that can outperform where they are drafted in this Alabama class this year. So with that said, we've touched on both classes pretty extensively, and we've kind of gotten an idea. I think we're both in kind of agreement, maybe the top of last year's class. Maybe not so much as you. I think that this class can have 4, maybe 5 first-round picks, and I don't necessarily think they have quite as many day 2 picks, but I think that overall, I'll just go ahead and say it. My personal opinion and who I'm going to give the victory to today is this year's class. I think that there's a lot more depth to it. I think there are guys that are being extremely underrated. Ridley, after that combine performance, I think that he is an elite wide receiver 2 with the very strong possibility of becoming a high-end wide receiver 1 eventually. Deron Payne, he's slowly seen his stock grow. Rashaan Evans, same thing. But there are so many underrated guys in this class. I got to give the overall nod today to the 2018 NFL draft class for Alabama. Who do you give the nod to?
Well, Clint, when you look at this year's class and you see guys like Ridley and Minka on the top, and they were absolute studs, superstars, legends in Tuscaloosa, and then some other guys who, like Payne, who really is a star, and I think he's going to be sort of burnt as a legend as well. But you got a lot of other guys. Rashaan Evans was great, but he's not necessarily going to be legendary as far as looking back. Ronnie Harrison, same thing. Ronnie Harrison played 3 years, played his true freshman season, much like Minka, but he's not going to be looked at quite the same way. But ultimately, I think I agree with you, Clint. I think that this year's draft class has so many big hitters early. Not as many as last year. We're not talking about Jonathan Allen and O.J. Howard and Cam Robinson, Reuben Foster, those guys who people really were liking last year. But there's a lot of potential early, and then even more potential for that gem player like we talked about later in the draft. And so when I think you look at it from a depth position, you look at it from that angle, there's no question this year's class looks like it's going to be a little bit more solid overall than last year's.
Well, this has been a blast. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you. This is one of my favorite times of year. I feel like it's Christmas. Free agency, of course, is getting started soon, and we couldn't be more excited about that, seeing where some of these former Bama players end up landing. But then, of course, the draft coming up at the end of next month. It's a great time for football fans. I've certainly enjoyed the conversation. Guys, this has been Bama Versus. If you've enjoyed it, go listen to some of our other episodes. We've had a blast. We're going to continue to be making more. Like, share, comment. We want to hear from you guys. Which do you think is the better class, the 2017 draft class or the 2018? And then, of course, after you give us that, like I said, like, share, comment. We want to have interactions with you guys. We don't want it to just be me and Jake. We want to get y'all's opinions too. So this has been another episode of Bama Versus. We're out.